Today I'm here with two amazing guests, and I'm just so excited to have them here. So, if you're a parent who's been wrestling with questions and you're trying to understand how your children's brain work, maybe you're trying to support them because their learning or cognitive abilities don't look the way that you expected. Whatever questions you have on attention, behavior, focus, all the things, you are in for a treat as these two ladies share all the things that they know. So, welcome to our show, Dr. Amy and Sandy. How are you doing today?
Fantastic. How are you?
Thanks
Awesome.
for having us.
It is my absolute pleasure. So before we get started, I just wanted to have you ladies introduce yourselves and then share how your work is different and how it complements each other. So Sandy, why don't we start with you?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think anybody's ever asked us that in that way, Amy. My name is Sandy Zamalis. I am a board certified cognitive specialist and owner of two LearningRx centers in Virginia. I have a center in Stanton, Virginia, and one in Harrisonburg. And a fun little tidbit for your listeners is I was actually a homeschool mom in the CHAP organization about 20 years ago. Feels like forever ago. But I was a really active member. We were part of the York Homeschoolers Association. I lived in York, PA at the time. And so I am just really passionate about not only the cognitive training that I do now, because I transitioned to that after my kids left home, but helping homeschoolers understand their kids. Because I've kind of been in this conversation for a really long time of helping parents troubleshoot why different curriculums aren't working. And then it wasn't until I got that cognitive piece, that cognitive training piece under my belt that I was able to finally make the bridge and connect it all. So that's my day to day now is helping families.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Amy.
I'm Dr. Amy Moore. I'm a cognitive psychologist, a board certified Christian counselor, host of the Brady Moms podcast, along with Sandy. And I have been working with neurodivergent learners for over 30 years. I started as a teacher and a curriculum coordinator before going back and getting a PhD in psychology. But I've been teaching teachers and coaching parents for that entire 30 years. And my passion is to find out what needs we haven't met that contribute to the struggles, not only with thinking and learning, but also those big emotions that we frequently see accompany struggles with thinking and learning. And so I'm I am no more alive than when I am actively troubleshooting, problem solving with parents to try to find out what's missing and how do we fill that gap.
Thank you so much. I love that you made that distinction about the big feelings and the emotions actually come as a part of the learning. So the frustration is not necessarily a behavioral challenge as much as it is an expression, maybe not so emotionally intelligent, of saying, I'm struggling with this and I need help. So I think it's important for us to make that connection.
Well,
So,
absolutely. And it actually is circular.
yeah,
So, those frustrations with thinking and learning can exacerbate the big emotions. But when we have big emotions, then we can't think and learn, right? Because the emotion part of our brain is hijacking the thinking part of our brain. So that's part of that problem solving, that troubleshooting is, what is the primary issue so
mhm.
that then we can work on that first.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I've even taught my children the language. I'm like, so tell me, is it the amygdala that got hijacked? Like, what exactly is happening? And they're starting to use the language. It's important for us to understand. I think the brain is fascinated. So before we jump in, I definitely wanted to level set, but really quickly, when would I talk to Dr. Amy and when would I talk to Sandy? I'm struggling with X, so call Dr. Amy. I'm struggling with Y, so call Sandy. And when do I need the both of you?
So, Sandy is in the trenches, boots on the ground with cognitive skills remediation. And so, when we have a child who is struggling with thinking and learning, and we've identified that there is a cognitive skills gap, not only does Sandy help identify whether there's a cognitive skills gap and what that gap looks like, then she's the one that's going to remediate that gap. So, I'm in the space of really working on emotion regulation, how it impacts thinking and learning, um, sort of providing that guidance. Hey, when do you need to see Sandy versus When do we need to go talk to a functional medicine physician? Because, this could be medical versus an educational struggle. I'm a clinical researcher, so I sit in that ADHD space and try to figure out really, for the most part, what ADHD kids need, but neurodivergent kids in general. And so I'm big picture, Sandy's in the trenches.
Awesome. Really helpful. Did you want to add something, Sandy?
No, she covered that really well. Yeah, I'm the day to day. I'm the, in the nitty gritty, working through skill building, one skill at a time, building that threshold for tolerance. And I would say Amy's on the top side in the bigger thinking space of looking at it more holistically, figuring out that the food issues, the sleep issues, all of the emotional pieces that go into how we think and learn, as well as the cognition piece. So I'm more like just that cognition piece, and she's broader.
And
Awesome.
what parenting strategies do we
Exactly.
need to adopt? Which parenting approaches might be contributing to the struggle, right? So
Mhm.
as a parent educator and a teacher of teachers, like I'm looking at what is the adult's role
Right.
in the influences on the struggles with thinking and learning, challenging behaviors and big emotions. And how do we make those adjustments in a
Correct.
way that honors God, honors the parent, and honors the child?
I love it. It's so holistic because I heard Sandy mention food and all the different things. So it's not this siloed approach, it's everything together. Let's do a little bit more level setting. So many people today, we talk about neurotypical, neurodiverse, special needs, and sometimes we use them interchangeably. For parents who are new to this conversation, could you help us understand the differences between those terms? What is more appropriate and what's like just politically correct?
Sure. Well, the term neurodiversity simply refers to the differences across all of the spectrum of human brains, right? Just like it sounds, diverse. So, all of our brains, while we have the same parts of the brain, the connectivity between the parts operates just a little bit differently across brains. And so, that's just this big umbrella term called neurodiversity. Neurodivergent is the term that we use that says there might be some pathology in this brain. There's a diagnosis that is making this brain function differently than the majority of brains would. And so that would encompass a diagnosis like ADHD, autism, a speech and language delay, a sensory processing disorder, anything that impacts the day to day functioning for that child or adult would classify them as neurodivergent. There is a camp that includes mental health diagnoses in that as well. In our space, we're really looking at neurodevelopmental differences, things that actually can be remediated in terms of thinking and learning. That's the space we sit in. So I'm not saying that we can't include mental health diagnoses, but typically neurodivergent refers to those neurodevelopmental diagnoses. And then neurotypical is the term for everyone else, right? You either have a diagnosis that makes you neurodivergent or you don't have a diagnosis that makes you neurotypical. I don't use the term neurotypical. I will talk about um, so if I'm giving a talk about the ADHD brain, I will say brains with ADHD versus brains without ADHD, because what does neurotypical actually mean, right? We do all have differences and nuances. And so I haven't loved that term since it came out. And so I don't use it very often.
Well, it just assumes that there's a baseline, right? And I think in our space, we've learned that everyone has different default settings. That neurodiverse language is really more appropriate because even within the neurodivergent space, there's a lot of diversity within those as well. So having neurotypical assumes a baseline, and that this doesn't, we don't see that very often.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that because when you think of fingerprints, we all have different fingerprints. So it's not like you have the better fingerprints or mine are right or wrong. It's just different, right? And it makes me think of an IEP, like the individualized education plan for those who are not familiar with the term. I've heard people say homeschooling is technically like an IEP because they're getting that individualized attention. But I wonder if you would agree with that or if there's some caveats in terms of someone saying, well, if they're homeschooling, they may not need this extra help or this extra support. So when would you agree that homeschooling is like an IEP, and when would you caution someone to say still seek support?
Yeah, so I think there is some truth to that, when we're homeschooling, we can individualize our instruction and our curriculum to meet our child's needs. But an IEP also refers to services that that child needs: speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, cognitive training, mental health therapy. And so just because we're able to individualize instruction and curriculum at home doesn't mean that we're qualified to provide the additional services that our child still might need. So, for example, even though I have a PhD in psychology, I could not provide speech and language services to my youngest child, who fronted many of his sounds and could not pronounce R's. He still needed speech therapy from a licensed speech therapist.
Sandy's like, that's it. She covered it.
Yeah, she covered it. I wouldn't add anything to that. I think we
No.
get caught up in it because we think of it as that individualized education plan. And when we're homeschooling, we certainly are individualizing our choices in
Yeah.
curriculum. We're individualizing our choices in style of teaching. We're trying to meet our children where they're at. But the piece that often gets forgotten is the services piece, like
Mhm.
she mentioned. Because if your child is having a reading issue, um, changing curriculum may not be the solution. They may actually need a specialist to help you figure out why is reading a problem for your child, so we can dig in a little bit and figure out what skill is missing, where's the gap, so that we can help the child achieve that particular skill. And the same thing applies with things like ADHD as well. A lot of times homeschool parents, even though we're individualizing our education for our students, when there's an ADHD issue, we still need some support to help our child figure out how to manage their day, how to prioritize their attention on things that are important, and work through some of the skill gaps that can show up for kids with ADHD, like working memory issues or processing speed issues or long-term memory issues. So you need both. Yeah, it's a yes and, I think, for me. Like, yes, you're individualizing, and it's really probably the best thing you can do for your child, but you may also need extra support to help them overcome any skill gaps that they have.
I
And
really,
I think that's a difficult thing for many homeschooling parents to wrestle with, because homeschooling parents tend to be DIYers, right? And so to be able to sit in that space and say, yes, I am fully capable of individualizing instruction for my child based on their interests and where they are in the spiral of math right now, right? We have to be able to recognize when we still need help, when we need to ask someone who has more expertise in this area than we do. And that's difficult. That's a difficult transition for many homeschooling parents to make.
And I think that shows up a lot with like dealing with frustration tolerance at home for homeschooling parents, because that's, I think, the piece that a parent really needs help with. If you've got a child and they're hitting walls and that frustration tolerance is really low, it's really easy to like divert or try to move around the issue instead of working through the issue.
Mhm.
And so that's where, someone who is a specialist and can help you dig a little bit to figure out where that frustration is coming from can help you as a parent, because just avoiding it is not going to help the child develop the muscle or strength they need to move through. And that's, as a parent, homeschooling parent, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for building strong, independent learners. We're looking for kids who love to learn. And so they also do have to manage that frustration piece so that they could be everything God has intended them to be.
Your last two comments just made me think of 25 questions. So I have to say that I love the perspective and the framing that you both use, because it's so liberating and it's very empowering, right? So you talk about the balances, you talk about the nuances, but you mentioned the uniqueness. So it's not like when you talk about the differences, you're saying we think differently, right? Going back to my point about the fingerprints, we think differently. We have different fingerprints, but it's not about right or wrong, right? It's about providing that support. So my first question would be, when you think about families who are either navigating cultural pressure or societal expectations or personal feelings, where they're like, I don't want to first admit that there's something off, different, or, that they're concerned about. And then you think about the well-meaning advice from friends where they're like, oh, it's fine, you're homeschooled and you can individualize it anyways. What would you say to that person who, like, what advice would you give? And what would you say it's comforting advice, but potentially dangerous? It's a loaded question.
Sure, it is. I actually love the question because so often, again, we want to be in that space of thinking I can meet my child's needs. I'm doing the best thing I can educationally for my child, and so they're not being bullied anymore. I've brought them home, right? We feel like we're doing the best thing for our child, right? We've got this. And fathers, I notice this more with fathers, and there's actually a theory about this. They have a harder time wanting to admit that there might be a neurodevelopmental disorder in one of their children because then it's a reflection of their genetic makeup, right? I perpetuated something in my genes that has caused my child to have a neurodevelopmental disorder, and I don't want to go there because then I have to wrestle with that, right? And so but moms too, right? I think we all wrestle with, did I cause this, right? Did I do something while I was pregnant that caused my child to have ADHD or autism or whatever the disorder is? And so I think it's important to set aside that struggle and look at the struggle that our child is having. And when we don't admit that our child is struggling, then we're denying the struggle.
Mhm.
We're not honoring that struggle. We're saying my child's struggle is not important enough for me to set aside my own feelings about it and help my child. And so if we liken it to a child who is diabetic, would we say, well, I don't want to admit that my child has a problem, so I'm not going to give my child insulin? Or I have a child with a broken leg. Well, I'm not going to take them to the doctor and put a cast on it because then I might have to admit that maybe I wasn't watching my child carefully enough on the playground, right? We're denying the struggle. And so that's sending the message to our child that I don't see you.
Um,
And a child needs to be seen in their struggle. They need to feel that there's emotional safety in that relationship between parent and child, and that my parent sees my struggle and my parent is willing to do whatever they can to help me.
hmm.
And if we don't, then we're denying that to that child. That sends a very powerful message to our child.
And we have to, I think, as parents, grapple with the notion that our kids can't always verbalize to us their struggle. They're experiencing life in the only way they've ever experienced life, so they can't let you know that what they see doesn't look like the thing that you said it looks like. They can't tell you, um, when their feelings are starting to ratchet up. They may not necessarily recognize those meters as they're starting to move into a place that lends itself to full meltdown. So they need us to have watchful eyes and to be thoughtful and to think about what's happening, even in that homeschool space. What triggered the meltdown? Was it something that, were they just hungry? Are they starting to get a cold, or are they sick? Did they not sleep well last night? Did we jump a lesson and all of a sudden now they're overwhelmed? Is this a reading issue that I'm pushing too hard? Like, there are things that we can do as the adult to help figure this out. And we should not necessarily rely on our children to always be able to tell us what's happening, because they don't know what's happening. Their perception is their world. And so only in a comparison situation would they be able to express it. Like getting glasses, right? Like one of my favorite stories that I have of myself is that I had like chronic ear infections as a kid. And when I finally got tubes put in my ears, I literally remember being in the car going, everything is so loud because in my world, everything was muffled. And then all of a sudden, the real sound came in, and it was so loud to my little brain. And it took a while to, figure that out. And I'm sure my mom had mom guilt that, that I couldn't hear for a while. And I know, same thing happens, like I said, with glasses. You're going around and all of a sudden you realize your kid can't see. And so you get the glasses, and how long have they not been able to see? So coming to terms with that as an adult, and just really owning that our kids need us to be their eyes and ears, and to really think through all what's triggering and problem solving all of the issues that we're seeing, so that, like Amy said, your child feels seen. Because you can ask clarifying questions. You can try to get them to communicate with you to see if you can investigate it a little further, but they need your guidance in that process.
What the two of you just shared is life-changing for anyone who is either on the fence or struggling. Because a lot of times when you think of the guilt or the shame, and like even the studies that Dr. Amy mentioned in terms of like the dad's thinking from like an ego perspective, like, wait, this is my fault, right? Like I see how the parents can kind of wallow in that guilt, but at the same token, what you said, Dr. Amy, was so important in terms of when you deny that struggle, whether you verbally say it or in the back of your mind, you don't, you just think it, or Sandy, to your point where you just kind of avoid it. When we deny that struggle, we delay the support, right? So like everything you said just resonated so deeply. And I wonder how much of, like you hear these messages like, don't worry, they'll grow out of it, or you're overacting, just push through. Like how much support would a child be able to receive if we didn't look at it as this earth-shattering thing? I'm going to share a quick story, and it's not meant to trivialize, a parent who has like, who's going through things of this nature. But this weekend, I took my boys to Urban Air Adventure. A petri dish of germs. But anyways, they knew they were going to go. So the night before, I said, okay, guys, get your clothes ready. So Saturday morning, we'll leave early. For reference, I do not go anywhere on a Saturday. I am so stingy with my weekends. I do not like to be out, but I wanted to take them. So we had everything planned in the morning. In my head, everyone is going to shower. They're going to put their clothes on, and we're going to leave. And that's going to be it. They end up having, my older two end up having some conversation about something. Maybe someone sat on my bed, someone had my toy, something so trivial that I can't even remember. But the reason I'm sharing it is I took it so personally, because in my head, I am the best mom about to take these kids to some fascinating place. And here they are arguing over some silly thing that I can't even remember. But my point in saying that is sometimes we take these things so personally, like it's my fault. Now I feel guilty. Now I feel shame. If I remove myself from that situation on that Saturday morning, instead of being so offended that they would have the nerve to argue and all I need them to do is get dressed and leave, to, again, not to trivialize it, but if we could say to ourselves, the examples you gave were so profound. My child cannot see, they need an assisted device. My child's leg is broken, they need crutches, they need a scooter. Like those things are so natural and normal for us. But when it comes to cognitive or neurological or something else, it's like, oh no, we can't do that because I have to admit failure. And it's not failure. Like you didn't do anything.
Well, it's so hidden.
Absolutely.
Yeah, those things are hidden. And they're often attributed to behavioral issues, right? Like I won't do this. It's a will or won't versus a can or can't conversation. And so I think that's the important piece. Yet there are times when our kids are being defiant and, maybe not doing something that we need them to do.
Mm-hmm.
But more often than not, it's a can or can't issue that we've got to kind of grapple with as adults.
Yeah, Dr. Ross Green, who wrote the book The Explosive Child, and he's the creator of the collaborative problem solving model. He says kids do well if they can. And so our job as parents is to identify what skills is my child missing that's keeping them from being able to succeed in this situation. And so sometimes that might be a cognitive skill. Sometimes that might be a social skill or an emotional skill. And so that's our job. We put on our detective hats and we say, what skill is my child missing right now? What's the barrier to success here? And is it sometimes the way we're communicating, sure, we have to make changes too, right? Nothing changes if nothing changes, and that change starts with us. And so we might have to make adjustments, and that's hard as parents. But that's our job. It's our job to do whatever we need to do to set our child up for success in life.
Yeah. So when you mentioned the frustration piece, it made me think that, there may be parents struggling to understand the difference between maybe a behavioral challenge and a cognitive processing difference, especially after disruptions of COVID. Like there's some children who have skill gaps and learning gaps that have not been covered or taken care of because of COVID. So when you think of, and I can't believe I'm talking about COVID in 2026, but anyways, when you think of those potential learning gaps and social changes, can you share practical or concrete examples of what a cognitive or processing challenge may look like versus something that's just a behavioral challenge?
Go ahead, Sandy.
You want me to go?
Yeah.
So a cognitive challenge might look like, for example, does your child struggle to retain and hold information? So you've taught the lesson, you think they've got it, and then they go to sleep at night and they wake up the next day and they don't remember any of it. Right? That would indicate there's a cognitive piece to that puzzle. Do they take a long time to catch on to things? Like when you're going through information, does it take just a little bit longer to click for one child over another? We're going to look at those kinds of things. Does their brain run too fast? Are they impulsive? They're having a hard time slowing their brain down enough that they can access their logic and reasoning skills. Do they struggle with pattern recognition? Do they struggle with sound processing? Can they hear the phonemes in words? Can they take them apart? Can they put them back together again? All of those pieces would be what we would look at on that cognitive side of the equation to help us figure out what's going on the learning side. Because kids can build knowledge and still struggle cognitively. They're two kind of separate parallel universes in how our brain processes information. And the problem for students is that they get frustrated when it's really labor intensive to get that knowledge to build. That's when we get frustrated as parents and educators. That's when they get frustrated because they're having to work really hard to get that information to stick. And so we've got to look at that cognitive piece of the puzzle to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. And then that's going to contribute to the behavioral manifestations of that struggle. Strong working memory is a big piece of emotion regulation.
Mhm.
Here's why. Working memory is that ability to hold multiple pieces of information in mind and then act on those pieces of information. If we are upset about something, we need to be able to hold all the alternative explanations for why this is happening and be able to strategize what are the alternative ways that I can manage this situation. If we don't have a strong working memory, then we can't keep all of those pieces of information in mind in order to come up with, oh, you know what? Maybe my brother really isn't mad at me. He really doesn't hate me. He's just frustrated that I went first when he wanted to go first. So I'm going to apologize to him for cutting in line at this restaurant. And then I'm going to tell him he can go first the next time, right? These are all these alternative explanations for what's happening. And making a plan for how we're going to solve this. If we have poor working memory, that just goes out the door. And I hit an emotional tailspin. He hates me. If he hates me, my parents hate me. If my parents hate me, the whole world hates me. Everybody hates me. I'm going to melt into a puddle of emotional turmoil in the middle of the restaurant floor now.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's just one example of one cognitive skill, right, that contributes to emotion dysregulation. And then we also need to learn distress tolerance skills. We need to learn emotion regulation skills, right? Like, do I need to do a breathing exercise right now?
Mhm.
right? To lower the temperature on my frustration so that I can reason through what's happening, right? And these are skills that as parents, we can easily teach our children if we have them ourselves. But frequently, what I see is the parent can't regulate their own emotions. And
Right.
emotions are contagious. We have these smart cells in our brains called mirror neurons. When you yawn, I yawn. That's mirror neurons in action. And mirror neurons are strongest between people who love each other. So that parent child connection, those mirror neurons are super strong. So parents upset, kids going to be upset. Kids upset, parents going to be upset. And so we have to learn to be able to recognize those cues so that we can then use some sort of distress tolerance skill or emotion regulation skill to lower the temperature in order to solve the problem.
Yeah. I'm not sure if there's any research on this because it's fairly new, but a modern factor that may complicate all of this, I imagine, would be screens and technology.
Mhm.
So, in a culture where children are constantly exposed to devices and digital stimulation, how would parents begin to determine whether attention struggles or behavioral shifts might be technology related versus something deeper?
You want to take that, Sandy?
That's a great question. I wish I don't have the research off the top of my head, and I'll let Amy chime in on what she knows. In general, what we usually recommend in our centers is that parents try to limit screens. There's a reason for that, for just the attention piece. Most of the stuff that our kids are watching on the internet anymore, it's really geared towards um, fast moving pictures, fast moving pieces of information coming at them, and that does not help them build sustained attention like we would like to see for children. So for that reason alone, I typically recommend kind of limiting screens as much as you can. But there's also the visual processing piece of that puzzle for me, which I don't, like I said, this is all anecdotal for me, but I've definitely noticed a shift in the last, I would say, 10 years or so in the ability for kids to use their imaginations
Okay.
because of how much screen time they have.
Mhm.
Um, Kids need more time imagining, drawing, thinking of stories in their heads. And when we're giving them those pictures all the time, we're limiting their ability to develop that skill. So, those would be my two things that I would really want parents to think about before they hand their child the screen. But I get it. I mean, they're everywhere. So it's just a really hard battle to do.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't take them away entirely. But developmentally, especially for kids that are young, we need to kind of think about it as how are we training that child's brain to process the world and information? And so we want to make sure they're also developing the ability to use their imaginative skills to be able to sustain some attention in something that's not designed to, keep them enthralled for hours at a time.
Yeah, Dr. Amy,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from you as well. I just wanted to really quickly say it's important. I love that you talked about imagination because
Mhm.
I was reading a book with my kids, either Little Woman or Charlotte's Web, I can't remember. But I said, all right, guys, now that we've read the book, let's watch the movie. And I found like some black and white picture. And I remember one kid saying, huh, that's not how I imagined her in my head. And I was like, oh, that's really good. So, they had this whole picture in their head based on us reading out loud. And when they watched it, they're like, yeah, there's a disconnect. I thought you'd be a this or that. So I thought that was really important. So, Dr. Amy, before you respond, I also wanted to know if you thought all screens were created equal. So, a kid doing FaceTime with a family member versus an online class live or pre recorded versus hit 'em up dopamine, fast moving. Like, would you say screen time is just screen time because it affects melatonin and all the other things, or is
No.
there a difference? Okay.
No, all screens are not created equal. And so first, let me just say, and this is not always a popular opinion. I get pushback on social media anytime we post my comments about screen time because I'm not anti-screen time. In fact, I feel very strongly about not taking our teenagers' phone away as a consequence for misbehavior because I think well, I know from research that connection is the number one buffer against mental health crisis. And when we cut off a teenager from a connection with their friends, then that actually worsens what's happening with their mental health. So they're not all created equal. And I don't think that we should make black and white decisions like that.
Mhm.
But uh, the research that is coming out in the last several years is saying exactly what Sandy is saying, right? So our working memory has never been worse, right? How many phone numbers do you actually know? Honestly, I can say there are very few phone numbers that I have memorized.
I forget mine half the time.
Right. We used to have to memorize all of the phone numbers when we used rotary dial phones. And so this is true. We're not forced to remember directions. How many times have you driven to the same place, but you still need your GPS to get you there? Right. It happens to me all the time. I still need my GPS to drive somewhere I've already driven 20 times. Back in the olden days, when we used a paper map, we probably only needed to use that map a couple of times because our brain encodes information differently. Our brain encodes our handwriting differently than it encodes print that we're seeing on a screen. And so it's very important that we balance as kids how we study, right? Whether we're typing versus writing, we're going to remember something more when we write it than when we type it. It activates more areas of the brain when we're writing than when we're typing. When we read on paper versus when we read on a Kindle, we encode the information differently. And so we can actually close our eyes and say, oh, that piece of information was on the top of page 37. When you're reading on a Kindle, where's the top of page 37? There is no top of page 37, right? So we can't necessarily remember where that information was in space. So all screens are not created equal, but you hit on something. And that's the dopamine reward system. And so when it takes more and more and more stimulation from what's happening in online games to activate our reward system, then when we go into real life, then we're going to struggle, right, to find that source of satisfaction from slower moving activities where the connection is actually happening. So no, I don't think all screens are created equal. I think FaceTiming with family members is essential. I think any time that we connect with loved ones, that's essential. So I think we just have to be really smart about our use of screens. Keep continuing to watch the research that's coming out, but not attenuate the human experience. Like, don't let that thin out. It's really important.
Very balanced perspective. I am so fascinated and amazed by the work that you do, and that's why I've been like rapid fire throwing questions, even though I typically conduct a slower interview. But I do want to give you the last couple of minutes to just share anything that you think would be helpful. You mentioned that you're approaching your 200th episode, so obviously you've done this a ton more than me. So like, what are things that you love to share? What are questions people always ask? You know, all the things. Like, if you could share one thing, like, I just want to leave it open-ended for you to share anything that you think would be helpful to listeners.
So I think the best piece of advice that I ever got came from my mom, who was also a child development specialist and expert. And she said, as parents, we should be open to all possibilities. And I think that adopting that mindset of curiosity, being open to many different possibilities for why our child is struggling, for why we're struggling as parents, to be curious, to be detectives, to say, I wonder instead of I worry. I think is that sets us up for success, right? We're going to get it wrong. We're going to screw it up. I screw it up all the time, right? We're but when we come at it with this idea that, hey, I'm curious about why this is happening, then it opens the world up to us, right? To research, for trial and error, for communicating more effectively with our child and collaborating on a problem. So just being open to all possibilities and having that mindset of curiosity.
I would piggyback on that with Amy and say that there's never been a time, we were just talking about the screens. There's never been a time when parents have been as inundated with information as they are right now. And it's only going to progress because with AI and with all of the resources we have on the internet, we can dig real deep into our kids. And my guess my encouragement to parents is I think for a long time, like cognitive testing kind of got lumped into IQ testing. And it was one of those things where it's like a badge of honor if you had a really high IQ, but you didn't really want to know if you had a lower IQ. But if we could look at it just as skill knowledge, like just think about cognition as skill knowledge, it would really help parents open the door to truly understanding issues that they're having with their kids. So we have lots of things that we as parents are dealing with in terms of food and sleep and just developmental milestones that we want our kids to meet. But let's also not be afraid to look at that cognitive piece because that affects the executive functioning piece. And if there's any stress or frustration in the parenting landscape, it usually lands in those two places. So having tools and resources and supports for those particular issues are just super helpful. And we can't turn a blind eye to them because they're really important and they're with us. Our brains are with us our whole life. So it's really important to understand how our brain is working.
Thank you so much. I heard someone say that we should always raise a child that we have rather than the one we wish we were given. And I think that's so important because everything you shared today, your knowledge, I know this conversation is going to help so many families, people who are feeling alone, people who are feeling misunderstood. I know they'll feel empowered and understand that what they're doing is supporting their children. And again, that shift from denying struggle equals delaying support. I'm so glad that you two highlighted that. So thank you for all you do and thank you so much for your wisdom.